Morning for those watching in the United States. Good afternoon in Europe. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this debate on should Europe go its own way, co-organized by the Eurasia Center and the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Now, I have to say, we do a lot of events, a lot of debates at the Atlantic Council, but I'm really particularly excited to host this one. You know our mission. We're committed to American leadership and engagement with allies across the globe, a mission that's made even more urgent by the challenges of the COVID and post-COVID world, the technological transition and great power competition. But that doesn't mean that we're looking backward. We have to question even our very assumption and know that the world is changing and go at the heart of the debate. One of them is indeed the future of the transatlantic relationship. As we've seen, different American administration progressively shift away from Europe, but also Europeans developing their own conversation on strategic autonomy, sovereignty, or digital sovereignty, from defense issues to technological regulation. We have a great conversation for you today with practitioners, academics, Europeans, Americans. So I'm really glad that we're doing this debate, and I really want to thank Dr. Will Ruger and the Charles Koch Institute for their generosity and support for this third debate today. Thanks for the many people who have been following these debates. We'll have others in the months to come. This is the third one. And I invite you to participate actively to the conversation on social media, where you can tweet either by saying stronger with allies or hashtag Europe leads, according to the side that you will side with in this conversation. I have my own preference, but I'm just introducing, so I won't try to nudge the conversation. With that, let me turn to our moderator today, Jacob Elbrun, the editor of the National Interest magazine.
The editor of the National Interest, and it is my pleasure today to moderate what I hope will be a hard-hitting and provocative debate about whether Europe should go its own way. We have panels of 4 speakers, beginning with Ambassador Gerard Araud, who is currently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. We have Ambassador Daniel Fried, of the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. We also have Dr. Katarina Smagley, Division Chief of the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine. And finally, but not least, we have Dr. Stephen Walt, Professor of International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School, who is a regular and prominent commentator on international affairs, including in a rival publication of mine, Foreign Policy. Our debate rules are straightforward, and the Atlantic Council runs everything with what looks to me like military precision. We have very hard and fast speaking times. We will first begin with an opening statement, then we will have a few questions from me, then rebuttals, concluding statements, and then you, the audience, get to weigh in for 12 minutes of questions. With that, I would like our first speaker to begin, Stephen Walt.
The issue before us is not whether the nations of Europe and the United States should be enemies or at odds on all issues. The issue is whether Europe and the United States should still be committed to sending troops to fight and die to defend each other. No one expects Europe to come here and defend America, so the real question is whether America should keep troops in Europe and spend billions to subsidize Europe's defense. The answer is no. For starters, Europe already goes its own way when the United States does something foolish. France and Germany opposed the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and they went their own way when the Trump administration left the nuclear deal with Iran and the Paris Climate Accord. At the same time, relying on American protection has left Europe incapable of handling the foreign policy problems it faces now. Just this week, the EU's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Joseph Borrell, said that Europe's neighborhood was in flames, but Europe lacks the capacity to address the problems in Ukraine or Libya or Syria, and America isn't going to solve those problems either. In short, depending on the United States to provide security is no longer in Europe's interest. It's not in America's interest either. China is our main foreign policy challenge today, and we will need to focus our military efforts on that problem and work overtime to hold our Asian alliances together. American deficits are soaring, and we have enormous problems to fix here at home. In today's world, defending the wealthy states of Europe is a luxury we can no longer afford. The United States sent troops to Europe in the past to prevent any single state from dominating it. But no country could conquer all of Europe today, so there's no need for the United States to be there to prevent this. If you're worried about Russia, remember that Europe has 500 million people, Russia only 145 million. Europe's combined GDP is more than $18 trillion. Russia's GDP is smaller than Italy's, only 1.6 trillion. NATO's European members spend 3 to 4 times more on defense than Russia does every year, and Britain and France have nuclear weapons. Europe can defend itself if it wishes, but it won't get its act together as long as it can count on Uncle Sam to ride to the rescue. Lastly, trying to invent new missions for the Transatlantic Partnership has failed. Going out of area didn't work, NATO fought and lost in Afghanistan, and the Anglo-French-American intervention in Libya merely created a failed state. Expanding NATO didn't work either. It poisoned relations with Russia and gave Putin ample reason to interfere in Georgia and Ukraine. Enlargement recreated the problem it was supposed to solve. Enlargement was also supposed to strengthen democracy, but Poland, Hungary, and Turkey have become less democratic under NATO's protective embrace. It's time to stop living in the past. The Transatlantic Partnership made good strategic sense when we faced a common threat, but Europe and America do not agree about China, trade, climate change, digital privacy, or in some cases, democracy itself. Instead of pretending our interests are identical and being disappointed with each other, Europe and America should cooperate only when our interests align and go our own way otherwise. We should therefore begin a gradual process of disengagement and let our European friends defend themselves. After all, we want countries like Afghanistan to be self-reliant so that we can come home. Should Europe's wealthy democracies be dependent on the United States forever? Remember, wise statecraft seeks to ride the tides of history instead of denying their existence or engaging in futile efforts to hold them back. Thank you.
Thank you for that concise statement, Steve. We will now turn to Ambassador Auro for his remarks.
Actually, I think that the right question shouldn't be should the Europeans go their own way, but also the question is, should the Americans go their own way? And the fact is that I think, as Stephen has said, in a sense, the Americans are going their own way. And when we are talking about the Trump administration, of course, but we should also remember that President Obama, in a sense, has not conducted a foreign policy fundamentally different from Donald Trump in the neighborhood of Europe. It's under Obama that the Americans didn't intervene in Ukraine. They hardly intervened in Syria, and under maximum pressure from the allies. They hardly intervene in Libya, and they are not intervening in the Sahel, which means that the neighborhood of Europe is in flame, and the Americans are not intervening, which is not reproaching. It's not saying that the Americans should do it, but they don't do it. And whoever is elected on 3rd of November, we can bet that actually the Americans are not going to intervene in Ukraine, in Syria, because the two presidents have felt the fatigue of the American public opinion for foreign intervention. So for the Europeans, as President Macron said publicly, the question is, we have actually to go our own way in our neighborhood, because our neighborhood is very dangerous. And what Turkey is doing right now in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea is a good example of the challenges that we are facing. So the question is, in a sense, is not whether it's we don't have any other choice. And I do understand that the Americans have decided that they don't want to be anymore the policeman of the world. Look at Libya. Try to imagine if the Americans were active, do you think that Turkey would have sent forces in Libya? Of course, no. So it's a new world that we are facing and that Europeans are facing, and they shouldn't really remain herbivores in a world of carnivores. As for the military presence of American military presence in Europe, frankly, it's an American decision. So if the Americans decide to leave Europe or to withdraw their forces from Europe, so be it. If they have kept these forces in Europe, it was because it was also an American national interest, or at least it was what the administrations believe. And as the figures are very clear, and if the Americans are leaving Europe, it will be to the Europeans, in a sense, to spend more on defense. And the French, we consider that we have some neighbors across a river who can actually spend much more for their defense. The question after that is whether we keep the alliance, we keep the Atlantic alliance between the US and the Europeans. And here I would think that it's important to look at the future. And in a sense, the future for us, it's not so much military challenges. We are facing together, I should say, civilization challenges linked to the export of the Chinese model, which is an authoritarian model, but also to all the challenges of technology, of the technological transition. And I do think that Europe and the Americans, really belonging to the same civilization, actually should work on these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was perfect. Now we turn to Katerina Smagley for her opening statement.
Yes, good morning. It's a pleasure to join this debate. Many thanks to the Atlantic Council for organizing and having me here. So as a representative of Ukraine, the country that belongs to Europe de facto, but not yet de jure, I am more of an impartial spectator who has no stakes in the discussion. Having promised my impartiality, however, I should also acknowledge my biases, because born in the Soviet Union, I will be forever thankful to the United States and the European Union for their joint fight against the communist dictatorship. Prime Minister Thatcher once said that Europe's debt to America was incalculable. Generous with its bounty, willing to share its strength, seeking to protect the weak, America helped to build the concept of Europe we know today. Do we still remember that strong US and EU partnership helped to liberate more than 100 million people who once lived behind the Iron Curtain? These days, as I see the brutality of Belarus riot police, the photograph of Alexei Navalny's pale face in Charité Hospital, I deeply miss the West I once knew, committed, reliable, strong, and undivided. The revisionist approach to the Transatlantic Alliance is astonishing, and I'm sorry to say sickening. It helps neither the United States nor the European Union, but those who wish to see them weak and void of leadership. I can understand the criticism of the Trump administration, which often belittled, undermined, and in some cases abandoned US allies. The American brand is indeed damaged, but 4 years of Trump cannot destroy the system of shared values, ethics, and traditions of character-driven leadership which took decades to develop. As Lincoln once said, the house divided against itself cannot stand. Europe and America need each other as global challenges facing them become more complex and urgent. They need each other in the area of defense and security. European army has been a hypothetical plan since 1950. The US is the strongest military power and there is no alternative to NATO. Those who claim that NATO has become obsolete, please come to Donbass and appreciate its blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Second, energy security. The US and European Union are not divided because of Nord Stream 2. The European Parliament reiterated concern about this project several times, but 60% of German MPs voted in support. We all understand where the threat is coming from, so please don't blame America. The good news is that the US LNG capacity is set to increase and play an important role in gas price determination and diversification of EU energy supplies. Third, Europe needs America to deal with climate change. Trump pulled out of the Paris Treaty, but emissions have been falling since 2004 due to the move away from coal. Joe Biden's pledge to spend $2 trillion on his climate plan is very promising policy proposal. Global warming is impossible to tackle without China, whose annual emissions tripled in the last 20 years. The United States and Europe can make it deliver on its promises only by working together. Next, EU and the United States should expand their partnership to combat non-traditional threats, corruption, disinformation, cyber theft. They need to work together to ensure that artificial intelligence is used to provide greater democracy and shared prosperity, not for espionage and as an instrument to curb freedom and opportunity at home and abroad. 6, COVID-19, infectious diseases. Russia, China, Iran used the pandemic to their geopolitical advantage. They spread conspiracy theories and drove wedges between the US and the European allies. COVID is a matter of national security for the US and Europe, and they should work together to deal with it. Europe and America should lead the way together, reclaim their credibility, and look with optimism and determination toward the future of their partnership. They have no choice but to stay together.
Thank you.
Full speed ahead.
We have to go to your partner now, Ambassador Pan-Fried. Thank you for those forceful remarks. Ambassador Fried.
Ambassador Fried, you're muted. Could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Thank you. The question seems to me somewhat out of context. Should Europe go its own way? Under Trump, the US has been going its own way, a bad way. Trump seems hostile to the EU, cold toward NATO. He saves his ire for democratic leaders like Merkel and reserves his affection for autocrats. Under Trump, the US has pulled out of the WHO, the TPP, the JCPOA, the Paris Climate Accord, and has even imposed sanctions against ICC officials. Trump and those who think like him seem hostile to the grand strategy that Europe and the United States have pursued since 1945 and enlarged after 1989, albeit with inconsistencies and blunders. But this strategy of support for a rules-based international order that favors democracy has worked. I do not want Europe to follow the US in Trump's pattern of destruction of this grand strategy. I do not think that a Europe-US split is a good thing. I don't want Europe to take a major problem with the Trump administration or the memory of problems with previous US administrations and create from it a permanent strategic split. If Trump wins in November, transatlantic problems will deepen. But if Biden wins and calls for a new era of transatlantic and democratic unity, how then should Europe respond? Should Europe, under these circumstances, go its own way? What would that even mean? There have been and will be differences between Europe and the United States on particular issues. 1980s, Europe was hostile to Reagan, and I remember the Pershing II missile debate. The US in the 1960s, terribly frustrated with de Gaulle. That seemed so consuming once, now so peripheral. Vietnam, Iraq, current issues of European defense that Professor Walt mentioned. There have been and will be on both sides of the Atlantic those who want to use these differences as wedges to engineer a strategic divorce. But let's get real. The world faces global challenges, COVID-19, climate change, new technologies, and challenges as well from autocrats, Russia and China. The US and Europe, together with core democratic allies, are better placed dealing with these and other problems working together than we would be alone, whether it's security, military or hybrid, economic or trade challenges, disinformation. We are better off working together. We, the United States, Europe, and other democratic countries around the world. Of course, we want a strong Europe able to think and act strategically in true partnership with the US. That's a good thing. A strong Europe is a good thing. And when we're thinking straight, the Americans understand that. But Europe going its own way as a matter of strategic preference makes as little sense as Trump's neo-great power nationalism. Europe and the United States should hold themselves to the standards that we established together after 1945, fixing what's wrong but retaining what's right. Nobody should start going their own way. We should chart our best course together. And a final thought. As we compare the US and European built international systems since 1945, let's not compare it to unattainable perfection. Let's compare it to the competition, the first half of the 20th century. Compared to that, we look pretty good. I'd not throw it out, not now, and not for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Freed. We have plenty of here. Our presentation question to Ambassador O'Rourke for the next 7 minutes. And my first question is going to bounce right off of what we just heard from our last two panelists. So my question to both Steve and the Ambassador Rowe is, was the Cold War, in fact, an aberration and not the template for American foreign policy? Are America and Europe reverting to their traditional historical roles? Or is the Cold War, in fact, the model that will continue to endure in promoting relations, transatlantic relations? Why don't we begin with Steve Walt?
The Cold War was not an aberration. It was consistent with the policy the United States had followed since it became a great power, to prevent any single power from dominating all of Europe or Asia. So in that sense, the Cold War was not an aberration at all. That's why the United States entered World War I and why the United States entered World War II as well. The problem is that the Cold War is over. It ended 25 or 30 years ago, and the circumstances that justified the permanent American commitment of troops to Europe and a security commitment there no longer exists. The Soviet Union doesn't exist, and Russia is not the old Soviet Union. So the conditions where the United States had to worry about a single power dominating all of Europe's industrial might no longer obtain, and Europe's wealthy democracies should be able to handle their own security affairs within their region, while the United States deals with larger strategic problems in other parts of the world.
Ambassador Rowe, historically, Europe has been a mess. Do you agree with what Steve Walt is saying? Can Europe, in fact, fend for itself, or would we be headed for disaster?
Well, I think, again, one of the weaknesses of the transatlantic relationship, it is that it's based basically on a military alliance. And we have not been able, after the end of the Cold War, to change our paradigm, the paradigm of the transatlantic relationship, which means that when the Americans want to do something in Europe, they go to NATO. And Stephen is right. You know, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is not a unifying threat. Russia is a regional power. It's a pain, but again, it's not a deadly threat to us. So if we have this conversation about NATO, brain dead or not brain dead, I think it's going to nowhere, because it really doesn't fit the real challenges that we, the Western democracies, we are facing.
One thing I wonder about, and I would like to follow up Ambassador Aroux, is we keep talking about America's view of Europe. But of course, a Pew poll just came out, I think yesterday, showing that America's reputation abroad has never been more abysmal than it is under Donald Trump. And that obtains, of course, also in Europe. If Trump were to be elected for a second term and to pursue a radical shift in American foreign policy, as I understand he is planning to do, what would be the implications for Europe and America? Would we, in fact, move in the most extreme cases to a situation where Europe began contemplating accusing the United States of human rights violations in international fora? Would you contemplate expelling American ambassadors? Would there be calls for sanctions, economic sanctions, against the United States for violating principles that Europeans today consider inviolable?
No, I think that the American election in November could be the most important election for us and maybe for the Americans, actually, since the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. It's very clear you have two antagonist visions of international life. And if Donald Trump is elected, it will be quite a challenge for the Europeans. I hope it will be a wake-up call for Europeans, but I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced. I don't know how Poland or Hungary will react, whether they are not going to rush to Donald Trump's White House to say, we are different, we could work together. So don't forget that Europeans are divided. As for what we should do versus the Americans, we have not reached the point of really confrontation to the point you are describing. But really look at what has happened in the last weeks at the Security Council, where all the members of Security Council, including UK, France, and Germany, have basically told the Trump administration, we do disagree with you. So we are able to say no to the Americans. But for us, the most important factor will be what should we do, since the Americans not only are leaving us, but also the Americans are undermining the world in which we believe. And I was referring to the image which is widely used of herbivores suddenly leaving the world of carnivores.
Steve, I wonder, what is your take on that? Can Europe actually impose costs on the United States eventually? Is there a cost to the United States for extricating itself as well as for staying?
Well, I think if the United States disengages gradually to permit Europe to have enough time to get its act together and be able to handle regional affairs itself, yes, the United States will not be able to dictate to Europe the way it has in the past. I don't want to overstate that, but one of the reasons the United States always preferred to work through NATO is it was the alliance that we led, and we were always reluctant to allow Europe to become somewhat more self-reliant. That will, I think, yes, reduce American influence somewhat, but I think the price is well worth it because the United States has many other strategic challenges. And there are still going to be a number of issues, as I think everyone on this panel agrees, where our interests do align. Climate change would be a good example. And nothing that I've suggested precludes the United States and Europe cooperating when, in fact, we agree on what needs to be done. But yes, I think we have to recognize that the United States would no longer be able to dictate European affairs in the way it used to in the past. I would just close by saying, remember, the United States hasn't really been dictating events in Europe either. We're not controlling what's going on in Ukraine. We're not being able to handle what's going on in Hungary or Poland as well. So we shouldn't overstate the amount of influence we have over Europe today.
Now we will move for a 4-minute rebuttal from Dan Fried, Ambassador Fried.
Thank you. I find it poor logic to complain that the United States should withdraw from Europe and at the same time suggest that there would be no bad consequences of doing so. the issue is not whether the US-European relationship is too grounded in NATO or military security. I agree with Gerard Auro's implicit point that the US and Europe need a better mechanism to coordinate general policy. But I think that that's a job for diplomats to put together and leaders. What we don't need is to engineer a US-European strategic split when China and Russia are challenging our security in different ways. Now, I have to mention something Professor Walt said, Russia not a threat? I'm sorry, ask the Ukrainians or ask the Balts. The fact of Russia's relatively small GDP doesn't mean it can't threaten its neighbors. Its threats to neighbors is a fact. It has started wars against its neighbors and is engaged in all kinds of hybrid aggression. Russia is a problem, and the US and Europe can deal with it better if we are acting together. I do not understand the call for greater cooperation simultaneously with engineering a strategic divorce. I think that's just wrong. I think the larger strategic issue is, and this goes back to the question about the Cold War and whether it was an aberration. The larger strategic issue is, in the world today, are we, Europeans and Americans alike, better off if we are, to the degree possible, arm in arm? That doesn't mean America dictates. It doesn't mean Europe can't differ with the United States. We always have and we always will. But the issue is, are we ultimately together? The US security guarantee to Europe is emblematic of that commitment. And before we throw it out, let's remember we fought 2 world wars and the Cold War for European security. Since the United States and Europe created a peacetime military and security alliance, we haven't had any such problems. I think we ought to stick with what has worked, fix what's wrong, and build on it, not throw it out.
Thank you. That was even, I think, before your time was up, a novel experience for us.
I reserve the time for future use in that case.
It is now my privilege to query both Katerina Smagley and Ambassador Fried. Let me ask you, you've pointed out what could go wrong for the United States, or you've alluded to it, but Ambassador Fried and Dr. Smagley, what do you think would happen? Let's say that President Trump is reelected, as has occurred more often than not with presidents running for reelection. And Trump either announces that he's pulling out from the NATO command structure, like de Gaulle, or he even says he's going to be more radical. He's going to, he's going to begin the process of pulling the United States unilaterally out of NATO. What would be the consequences? What would happen? Ambassador Fried, why don't you start?
I find that a sadly reasonable question to ask. I think it likely that a re-elected President Trump would move indeed in this direction. Now, Professor Walt's arguments lend support, or would lend support, to Trump doing exactly that. I think the results would be catastrophic. I think that a strategic split between the United States and Europe, no matter how we dress it up, would be seen as an assist to the Putins and Xis of this world and damaging to us all. I don't think that splitting the democratic world at a time when we ought to be rallying it is going to serve American interests, European interests, or the interests of what we used to call extravagantly the free world. I think that the consequences of re-entering a period of great power, hyper-realist maneuvering, and abandoning the best features of the West's policy since 1945 would not work out well.
Dr. Smagley, I wonder if you could elaborate on that. In particular, what's in it for the United States to protect Ukraine? It's obviously good for Ukraine, but how does it accrue to America's benefit? Either you might make the case morally or in terms of military power. I'm just curious. What's your response?
Well, as you remember, Mr. Brzezinski once called Ukraine a keynote in the arch. I strongly disagree when our partners in this debate say that the Cold War is over. It is not in Mr. Putin's head. Mr. Putin still lives under the Cold War mentality. He occupied the parts of Georgia. He illegally annexed Crimea and has built up a military base. They are much stronger than it used to be under independent Ukraine. It has occupied parts of Donbass. Its army murdered more than 14,000 soldiers in the east. Ukraine, which currently has 42 million people, can closely fall under the Putin's and Russian domination politically. We already have in parliament strong pro-Russian lobby. And if we feel that Europeans and Americans abandon us, this will cause a lot of disappointment internally. Our closest neighbor, Belarus, protests have lasted for the last months. The tide of protest is still very strong. There is no sight that Europe and the United States working together to protect democracy in Belarus. With unstable Belarus and unstable Ukraine, European Union will have a big area of instability right at its borders. Do you think it is in the national interest of the European allies and the United States? I doubt so.
Ambassador Fried, I'd like to actually flip the question that I asked you before. And now let's focus on Vice President Biden. Let's say that he takes the oath of office and becomes president. How much would he, in fact, improve relations with Europe? Or are there intrinsic difficulties that he would either be disinclined to address because he's focused on American domestic turmoil? How much better would things get?
First, I want to take issue with the premise that it is an either-or choice, that if we want to rebuild America, we have to withdraw from the world. I think that that is a false choice, and we learned through hard experience in the 20th century that America is safer and more prosperous if the world is at peace generally, and if an American and democratic system of rules allows for greater general prosperity. And these are the lessons of the 20th century, so it's not one or the other. I think it likely that a President Biden would turn quickly to Europe and rebuild alliances with Europe, more so, I think, even than President Obama after the Bush administration. I think I judge this by my knowledge of Biden's senior foreign policy people and what Biden has said himself. So the question is, do we think this is a good thing to rebuild alliances? And should Europe reach back to the United States if a President Biden reaches out? Or do we assume that Trump is right, that America must cut its ties to Europe, that our values-based foreign policy is really a fool's errand or a cynical game? Because that's what Trump believes. No matter how we pretty it up, the neo-isolationist, nationalist unilateralism of Trump and his administration has a history in American foreign policy. He didn't make it up. It's real. But the results have proven strategically disastrous before, and I don't want to keep putting my hand on hot stoves to find out whether it still burns. Trust me, it does.
Thank you, Ambassador Fried. We will now turn to Steve Walt for a 4-minute rebuttal, and I cannot resist throwing in a query for him that he may want to address along the way, which had occurred to me there may be an inconsistency in your earlier response, Steve. where you said, it'll be fine, Europe will get its act together and we'll leave. But what I hope you will address is, should we, from your perspective, should America leave even if Europe can't get its act together? The record of Europe getting its act together is poor. So why are you concerned about whether or not Europe gets its act together? Aren't you focusing solely on American interests?
Okay, well, that's not really a rebuttal. That's asking me another question. But in any case, let me give you my rebuttal and I'll try to address that along the way. The one thing we all agree on is on Donald Trump, that he has been a disaster as president, and it would be better for everyone if he no longer is in the White House. Nobody here is calling for the United States to withdraw from the world. We're talking about what our strategic priorities ought to be. The other side in this debate is nostalgic for the Cold War. They want to keep things just as it was back when there was really a big Soviet Union and we had something, a common strategic threat to unite the alliance. I have news for them. The Cold War is over. Russia is a problem, but it is not an existential threat to the United States. It is not threatening to dominate the European landmass. What the other side wants is the United States to continue to subsidize European defense. Yes, I can understand why Ukrainians want Americans to come protect them. The question is whether or not that's something the United States should do, or whether or not that's something the United States is going to do. NATO enlargement, remember, was supposed to make Europe peaceful and was supposed to spread democracy. But now we're being told, of course, that didn't work, that we spread it eastward and we now have big security problems that now we have to go solve there. And as I mentioned earlier, it didn't seem to reliably spread democracy if you look at what's happening in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. Finally, yes, I agree. The European army has been a hypothetical exercise precisely because the Europeans could always count on Uncle Sam to ride to the rescue and therefore were able to underinvest. They are now discovering, because the United States isn't going to solve all their security problems, that they do have to get their act together. Last point I would make here is that nothing either I or Ambassador Auro have said precludes cooperation on the issues where we still have interests that are strongly aligned, like climate, like possibly China, if Europe ultimately decides that they agree with us on China. I would just note one final point about this. The way we have handled European affairs in the past has been pushing Russia and China together. That's not a particularly powerful natural alliance. And one of the things, as French President Macron has emphasized to some consternation in Europe, is that we need to start looking for ways to try and pull Russia and China further apart. That's a very controversial view in Europe, but it's something we certainly ought to be thinking about. And then finally, with respect to Jacob's final comment, I do not think that Europe, repeats the 1930s if the United States is not actively involved there. But remember, the reason the United States was committed to the security of Europe was because we didn't want any single power to dominate Europe. That problem is not a problem today or at any point in the foreseeable future. So in the very worst case that Europe doesn't get its act together, it is still, in my view, not an existential threat to the United States, particularly when the United States is going to have to worry much more about what is happening in Asia with the rise of China.
We will now turn to, we're going to have conclusions. The first will be 3 minutes from Dr. Katerina Smagley. Please proceed.
Well, frankly speaking, I'm a little bit surprised by this debate. And let me pick up from the very last point where our co-debater said that we put China and Russia in the same basket. I'm very sorry, these two countries put themselves in the same basket because they both share a authoritarian type of leadership. If United States and European Union will not put their act together, they will very soon be squeezed out, not only from the economic markets, but also from defense markets, from the war on climate change, from the war on disinformation, and other new threats that exist in the world. I once again want to reiterate my point that the Cold War is not over, because the Russia that we see today is very similar to the Soviet Union that I still remember when I was a child. We were told that NATO is mainly a military alliance, and this is the problem. Well, let me tell you, as a country, as a representative of the country which aims and wishes to join NATO, that NATO in Ukraine doesn't only help to strengthen our military, it helps us in many other ways to fight with corruption, to increase civic oversight of our military. It also helps us with reform. NATO nowadays plays so many other roles which are important to preserve stability in Europe. And that is why it is critically important for stable and prosperous Europe and United States. Finally, I'm deeply disappointed by the arguments that Russia doesn't pose a threat to the United States. Excuse me, election meddling is not a joke. Russia hacked your own democratic systems of election, and there is a huge possibility that Russians will play a role in your elections once again. The elections, so important as we discussed during this debate. All American intelligence agencies have concluded that Russia did play a role in your elections. So I can only urge you not to underestimate its role and the role that it still plays in Europe by killing citizens, EU citizens on their own soil, by playing dirty games with your politicians, and by promoting and exporting plutocracy both to the United States and to the European Union. That is why I strongly support everything that Ambassador Fried has just said. Europe and the United States should stay together. There is no other way for them to succeed in these new global security threats and challenges that we face all, especially in my country, Ukraine, which has Russia right at its neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smagley. We will now turn to Ambassador Aroux, who I should commend for his valorous attendance on our show today. He tells me it's 95 degrees in Paris right now. We're grateful for him for participating. And he will now address our minute conclusion.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think very often when people are talking about the liberal world order, actually usually I have a smile because it's a sort of a way of hiding what was an American-led order, an American-led world on one side, and the other side there was a Soviet-led world. I'm not sure that rules were that important. What mattered was American hegemony. The Americans were the first world military power, and they were opposing the Soviet Union, and we were under the American umbrella. The Cold War is over. It's a fact that whoever is elected in November, the Americans are not going to solve a lot of problems like Ukraine, Syria, and so on. So it's a fact. The Europeans, it's not a question of breaking China or divorcing from the Americans. It's simply that we have to go our own way because the Americans are not withdrawing from the world. We are not back to the 20s. It's not possible. But the Americans are simply really looking at what are their vital interests and not all what they were doing elsewhere in the world. We have seen the cost of an interventionist policy in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It was a total disaster. So I think it's the right moment also for the Americans to look at what they are doing, and I do understand that they would consider it's time to reduce their involvement, their world involvement. But again, it's not either or. It's simply it's changing and it's irreversible. As for the military presence in Europe, I think again it's an American choice. If you want to leave, you leave. It's really. And the Europeans, again, the Germans are spending 1.3% of their GDP on defense, the Italians 1%, the Spaniards 0.9% of their GDP on defense, really, if they were going to spend 2% or even 1.8%, it would make a lot of difference. The Europeans have lived, thanks to the American protection, in a sort of ahistorical, I'm talking about the Western Europeans, in a sort of ahistorical paradise. We could talk in terms of dialogue, of great ideas, because the Americans were doing the job. And now some Americans are telling us, no, we are not going to do the job all the time if our basic interests are not at stake. So basically, I do believe that Europeans have to come back to history. We have to come back to history, and history is tragic. So it's difficult to understand, and we have a very good example right now, again, in Eastern Mediterranean, where basically you see France and trying to help Greece against Turkey. Not because we love Greece, we do love Greece, but we consider it's our national interest. So let's go back to this thought, to a policy, and really a policy of realism, policy of the power politics of today. And of course, we should work with the Americans if the Americans want to work with us. We are not pushing the Americans out. Apparently, they are tiptoeing out.
Thank you, Ambassador Rowe. We now turn to the long-awaited questions from the audience. And the first question, since we've been dwelling in the realm of high politics and diplomacy, I want to ask a somewhat more practical question from Ingo Steinhäuser, who says, what would be the practical effect of a Biden administration on Nord Stream 2? Would his policy or approach differ significantly from that of President Trump? And I'd like to pose that first to Ambassador Rowe, then followed by Ambassador Fried.
No, I think Nord Stream 2 is a very embarrassing issue for our German friends. They are stuck with this project. I know that Chancellor Merkel would prefer to get rid of it, but it has reached such a point of realization that it's quite difficult. The Germans feel they are trapped. I think the difference between Biden and Trump will be, and it will be the case in on a lot of different issues, it will be also different of methods. Really basically between on one side threatening and insulting, and the other side trying to understand the German predicament and trying to find a way out for the Germans out of this project, because I'm convinced that I know that Chancellor Merkel would want to get out of it.
Ambassador Fried.
I agree with Gerard Arreau. I think the Germans walked into a bad decision. Governments make bad decisions. Ask me how I know that. And they're I think they would like to find a way out. And this is part of a German reassessment of Russia policy. I mean, ironic that, we've heard claims that Russia's no big problem. But in fact, the Germans are reassessing their assumptions about Russia and really about Putin and his aims. I think Ambassador Arreau is right. A Biden administration would give the Germans more room to try to find a solution to the Nord Stream 2 problem without the political humiliation of giving into Trump's pressure. And I hope they do. There are ways, either Nord Stream 2 is a bad idea. Well, it is a bad idea, and either it should go away, or the Germans need to put more energy, so to speak, into ways to mitigate its strategic risks for Europe.
We have a question for Professor Walt from Roman Kilsek, who asks, what makes Professor Walt think that Europeans will not react to American disengagement from Europe by disallowing the US the ability to deploy European air bases for power projection into the Middle East? In Germany's case, for example, by losing the Bremerhaven port or the Ramstein air base, would at least create a logistical migraine. The United States cannot have its cake and eat it too. Professor Walt, Ambassador Rowe, any thoughts?
My immediate reaction is that that's obviously a potential consequence. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how has the United States used those power projection capabilities and that infrastructure over the last 25 years? We've primarily used it to intervene in places like Iraq and elsewhere. And then you ask yourself, how well have those adventures gone? So if you think the United States still needs the ability to project lots of military power into the Middle East quite rapidly, you might think those bases are really necessary. I frankly think those adventures have not gone particularly well for the United States. And once again, if you're looking ahead, you're looking at the world that we're moving in towards, it's a world where the United States is going to be focusing primarily on China, and those bases are not going to be as valuable. I wanted to add one other point here because it's come up repeatedly, and that's that nobody thinks Russia is not a problem. My point is simply that Russia is a problem that the United States should be relying primarily upon our European friends to help solve, not trying to let the Europeans put it back on the United States, which has been the habit all along, and which we've heard some other members of this debate suggest.
Ambassador Rowe?
No, I really have nothing to add to what Stephen said. But my bet would be that the Germans would want to keep the American bases, really, because after all, having American bases, it means American soldiers, and an American soldier is a sort on the American soil, on German soil, is a sort of military guarantee of Germany. So I think the logic would be for the Germans to say, we keep the bases.
I have a question from Elaine Sorrell that perhaps Dr. Smagley could address, which is she raises the prospect of Trump's personal finances. What bearing, if any, do they have on his foreign policy approach, particularly to Russia? Do you have a view on that?
I certainly don't have a view on Mr. Trump's personal finances. I know that there have been a lot of scandals in Ukraine related to attempts to draw Ukraine into America's domestic politics. Ukraine wants to stay away of this conflict. Ukraine doesn't have a stake in the US presidential elections, and we don't have a candidate in these elections. I have to say that the Trump administration has taken a lot of decisions which helped Ukraine defend itself. And we're very thankful to the Trump administration for this decision. So there have been both good and bad things which had been done by the White House over the last 4 years, and we have to consider all of them in balance.
We have a final question. We're running out of time from William Janis, which I will pose to Ambassador Rowe. We have about 1 minute left. He asks, if NATO disbanded and Germany was forced to rearm, well, it has rearmed, coupled with a militarily different pre-1939 Poland, would Russian anxiety or self-interest in some strange way seek to keep NATO intact? This is from William Janis at the Fordham Law School.
Well, I think it's typically it's an academic, very academic question. Really, I'm not sure that the Russians are able to have this sort of bold thinking, really, or long-term thinking. I think that if I were Russian, and I think the Russians are doing it, the goal of the Russians is obviously dismantling NATO, dismantling the European Union, because it's always better to have a divided Europe facing you and not to have the Americans guaranteeing the security of the Baltic states or the security of Poland. Because obviously for Poland and the Baltic states, NATO is not the French guarantee, but it's the American one. So let's not be too complicated in our thinking. I think the Russians would agree favorably the end of NATO.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes our session. Thank you very much, everyone who watched, and to our panelists as well.